Guten Tag, Klasse. Heute we're going to be looking at reflexive verbs with accusative reflexive pronouns. And you have several of these verbs on your vocab list this chapter, such as sich schminken, sich rasieren, sich anziehen, sich die Haare bürsten, sich die Zähne putzen. Any of these verbs that have sich in front of them are reflexive verbs, and we need to learn what to do with them. A reflexive verb indicates an action you do to yourself or for yourself. So it's things that reflect back on you. I'm doing something to myself, you're doing something to yourself, he's doing something to himself, we are doing something to ourselves, they are doing something to themselves, and you guys are doing something to yourselves. So the subject of a reflexive verb is also its object. For example, if I am shaving myself, I am the subject and myself is the direct object, the thing that is being shaved. So I and myself are actually the exact same thing. So here we have it being the subject and the direct object. We have this example from our Fotoroman. Melina says, du musst dich zum ersten Unterrichtstag duschen und rasieren. So dich duschen, you need to shower yourself, und dich rasieren, to shave yourself. She also says, ich erinnere mich. So I remember. She's recalling something for herself. Reflexive verbs always use reflexive pronouns. Since the subject of the verb is also its direct object, it takes the accusative case. So anytime you have the subject of ich, your reflexive pronoun will be mich. I am doing this to myself. Du und dich. Sie, es is sich. Wir is uns. Ihr euch. Und sie, plural and formal, sich. So ich schminke mich. We see that ich and mich are partnered up there. Duscht sich. He is showering himself. So here we have the and sich. You will never use, for example, ich with uns or du with mich. You cannot do that. They're always partnered up with the reflexive version of themselves. You will notice that that list of pronouns is very similar to the personal pronouns. The only difference is that the sie, it's not sie and ihn, it's sich for is sich, sie, sich, and es sich, as well as the sie plural and formal becomes sich. And notice that sich is never capitalized, even when it refers to the sie formal. So here you have two sentences as examples. Sie duscht sich. So now the sich is referring to she, herself. And sie duschen sich, you shower yourself, you formal. The sich is also lowercased. So both forms of sie have lowercased sich. These verbs follow our typical verb rules that we have to have subject-verb agreement. So if you have ich, your verb has to end in an e. If you have du, the verb ends in st, and so on. You also have to make sure that the reflexive pronoun agrees with the subject. If it's ich, it's mich. If it's du, it's dich. So here you see I underlined the subject, the verb, and the reflexive pronoun, and they all have to agree with each other. Some verbs are both reflexive and not reflexive, so it depends what definition of them you want. For example, anziehen is on our vocab list. It means to put on. So if I'm putting on a coat, it's not reflexive. Ich ziehe den Mantel an. But if I am getting dressed, ich ziehe mich an. If I'm asking a question, for example with fragen, maybe you're asking Frau when the quiz is. Ich frage Frau, wann ist das Quiz? But if I'm using it reflexively with sich, now I'm asking myself something, which means I wonder. Ich frage mich, wann ist das Quiz? I wonder when the quiz is. Verbs that are reflexive in German aren't always reflexive in English. So this is a time where whenever you do translations, it's not going to directly translate, which is part of the problem with wanting to translate everything word for word sometimes. So the example I just gave with ich frage mich, we don't say in English, I ask myself. We say, I wonder. Also, another example I put here is to say that I am showering or I'm taking a shower. That's not reflexive in English, but in German, they would say, ich dusche mich. I shower or am showering myself. Several verbs that deal with daily routines and hygiene, which is our chapter theme, are reflexive. So here's a good list of them to help us out for later throughout our chapter when we're talking about things that we do every day. I want to point out what to do, for example, if you have verbs that are separable. For example, I'm going to use the highlighter here. Sich ausziehen, sich ausruhen, sich abtrocknen. Whenever you have a separable verb, that prefix goes to the end. And that doesn't change just because we also have to add reflexive pronouns now. So if I'm drying myself off, ich trockne mich ab. If I'm resting, ich ruhe mich aus. So just wanted to point out what to do with those separable prefixes. Here you see down here an example where we have the past tense. So if we're using sich entspannen to relax, so the past tense is hat entspannt. The reflexive pronoun is still showing up in that third spot after the verb. Wir haben uns am Wochenende entspannt. If you're talking about like I have shaved, ich habe mich rasiert. So it's still following your typical sentence structure rules. Since we're talking about sentence structure, whenever you have these reflexive pronouns, they come directly after the conjugated verb. So typical German sentence structure is subject, verb, indirect object, direct object. For example, ich gebe dir das Buch. If we have a verb with a reflexive pronoun, that reflexive pronoun comes right after the conjugated verb. If for some reason we have a question and we put the verb first to form a question, that's the only thing that changes. You would switch up the subject and the verb. So they would switch places. Verb, subject, and the reflexive pronoun stays put. If you have a sentence like this example here, with heute Morgen schminkt sie sich nicht, and you had time first, so typically we've got subject, verb, indirect object, direct object. So if you put time first, the German rule is that the verb has to be second. So that's the only thing that's going to change. So we'll have time, verb, subject, indirect object, direct object. And that reflexive pronoun, like you see here, is showing up after the subject because it stays put right where we would normally put it. There's your reflexive pronoun just like it is down here. For command forms, you would put the reflexive pronoun immediately after the verb. So here's the example with shave. I want to tell you to shave yourself. I don't say do. There's no do. Just like in English, I don't say shave or you shave. I'm just saying shave. So rasier, but we still need that reflexive pronoun. Rasier dich. If it's a command to all of you guys, I'm using an ihr command. Rasiert euch. If you have a sentence with a modal verb, the rule still remains the same that the reflexive pronoun goes immediately after the conjugated verb. So our example from the other slide, ich rasiere mich, if I'm changing it to say that I would like to shave myself and I'm using möchte, is right here, möchte, the second verb is now rasieren and has to be at the end. But this reflexive pronoun does not relocate. It stays after the conjugated verb. Ich möchte mich rasieren. I would like to shave myself. And even though we have reflexive verbs instead of regular verbs, Sentence structure does not change whenever you're doing the past tense. So think of a basic sentence like, ich habe Fußball gespielt. You have habe and then the past tense at the end. Same thing for reflexive verbs. So here's an example with sich duschen. You still have habe with geduscht at the end. And that leaves only one place where you can put that reflexive pronoun, and that is in the middle. And again, it's following that conjugated verb right here. Ich habe mich geduscht. I have showered myself. Some examples on this slide. Ich habe mich heute Morgen rasiert. So habe with rasiert at the end, and the mich is right after the conjugated verb, just like it was in the present tense. Same thing with Plusquamperfekt. If we had showered, wir hatten uns geduscht. And that reflexive pronoun comes right after that conjugated verb. So that was an overview of how to use reflexive verbs with accusative pronouns. We will continue on with how to use them with dative pronouns later, but for now, this is our focus.